The turn of the autumnal season blew fresh, brisk winds across the vast Kentucky plains. So, too, came Annie Whipple. Recently widowed, Annie was leaving her former life on the East Coast and had decided to migrate west in search of a new life and a renewed purpose. She found herself at the door of Mr. and Mrs. Houston, and soon took up post as a nanny and governess to the couple's 3 children. The boisterous, lively youngsters made Annie feel vital and alive once more, their youth a tonic for her ailing soul and ambition. However, everything in this world is temporary, and just as quickly as Annie began to feel revived in the company of her new charges, one of the children had begun to fade. One of the Houston's daughters' health had slowly began to diminish until the child was merely a shell of her former self. A string of doctors and nurses came to assess the child, but the prognosis was not positive. The family were told to prepare to say goodbye to their precious little girl. Annie was devoted to the child and spent morning, noon, and night at her bedside, feeding her, reading to her, and caring for her every need. When the child fell into a restless slumber, Annie would occupy her worried mind by reading newspaper articles or national circulations. One afternoon, after a particularly hopeless day of watching the little girl suffer before her, Annie picked up a paper and found an article featuring the medical miracles of one Dr. Anderson. He was a marvel who appeared to be able to cure any malady. So unorthodox was he that some even called him a witch doctor. Annie was a deeply religious woman who had no inclination to the occult, but desperate times called for desperate measures. And the testimonials surrounding Dr. Anderson's work were compelling. For the first time in a long time, Annie felt hope flood her body. Tomorrow, she would hitch up the horse and buggy and head directly to Dr. Anderson's. He would know how to help the little girl wasting away before her. The next day, Annie made the long and arduous journey to Dr. Anderson's. However, when she arrived at his home, the building was covered in black drapery. The town was in full mourning. Dr. Anderson had just died, and Annie found herself stumbling into his funeral. Her only hope now 6 feet deep beneath the earth. Devastated and dejected, Annie turned around to make her helpless retreat back home. That night, as she sat next to the dying girl's bed, she read an article about automatic writing, a process in which a person can commune with the dead by allowing their spirit to flow through them and produce written words. This gave Annie a new idea. There was a known local hoodoo woman in Louisville named Miss Josephine. Perhaps she could help Annie. Miss Josephine met her patrons under a local tree known for its knotty, twisted branches and crooked trunk. There, Annie met her and described her plight. She asked Miss Josephine to teach her how to engage in automatic writing so she could seek the advice from Dr. Anderson. The article had stated that the freshly dead were the easiest to contact, and if Dr. Anderson was that successful of a healer in life, he would have taken that knowledge and expertise into the afterlife. Miss Josephine knew all about the ritual of automatic writing and talked Annie through the process. She gave her some tools that she would require: a gardenia candle, a bag of grave dirt, and a parchment with a prayer scrawled across the top. Miss Josephine told an anxious Annie that she would need to read the prayer and invite the spirit to possess her so they could use her body as a conduit for communication. Eagerly, Annie drunk in Miss Josephine's instructions. Settled back at the Houston family home, Annie retreated to her bedroom and began to ready herself for the ritual. She was going to contact the deceased doctor. There in her room, she laid out the parchment, sprinkled it with the grave dirt, and lit the candle. After reading out the incantation, she called out to the beyond. "Dr. Anderson, please come to me. You're the only one that can help this poor child. Please give me the guidance and the knowledge to cure her." The room was silent, but it felt heavy and electric with the unknown. Slowly, Annie felt a psychic fog fall upon her. She fell into a deep trance, and when she regained consciousness, she looked down at the paper before her and saw a curious sight. There upon the parchment was a line of text, written in a hand and language foreign to Annie. The next morning, Annie went to dispose of the nonsense script when a medical student staying at the Houston's mansion caught a glimpse of it. He asked Annie where she had gotten this prescription from. Annie was stunned. She had no idea what was on the page, let alone that it was a prescription. The medical student examined the paper and told Annie it was written in Latin and that the drug was used to cure chills, fevers, and fits. Could this help the little girl? The medical student advised Annie to take the prescription to the pharmacist and ask their advice. Annie darted to the pharmacist, who filled the order and told her it was worth a try. Invigorated, Annie raced back to the Houston mansion and administered a dose to the dying child. There Annie sat, eagerly awaiting the results from her mystically derived remedy. Slowly, the child began to stir. She regained consciousness, flush with color and renewed vitality. Annie was delighted. Dr. Anderson had come through for the girl. However, by nightfall, the child was worse than ever, racked with fever, cold sweats, and unceasing, incurable bouts of fits. Frantic, Annie returned to her room. Once again, she called upon the good doctor and asked for further guidance. In the morning, when she woke, she found a new directive written in Latin within her hands. She once again sought advice from the local chemist, who confirmed that this new medication also helped cure fever and fits. Relieved, Annie purchased the tincture and scurried home to administer the prescribed dose. Annie sighed with relief as the child regained consciousness and smiled up at her loyal governess. However, by nightfall, the child had relapsed back into the pits of her illness. Frenzied and alarmed, Annie once more tried to contact the doctor. She repeated the ritual and woke the next morning with yet another prescription. The handwriting was different than the first two, and it didn't look like Latin, but that did not stop Annie from running directly to the pharmacy and filling the unknown prescription. She didn't even stop to ask what it was or what it cured. In a frenetic attempt to ease the child's suffering, she once again ran back to the bedside and gave the child a liberal dose of the latest potion. This time, however, the child did not even have a momentary reprieve, but rather fell instantly into a violent and horrific seizure. The little girl was so violently ill, the local doctor was called immediately. Upon his arrival, he was horrified to see the new prescription bottle on the child's bedside. "Where did this prescription come from?" the doctor roared. Annie stammered an explanation as the doctor railed at her. "You foolish, insolent woman! What have you done? This medicine is not for her condition. You've poisoned her." As the family gathered around for what was surely the child's final hours, Annie fled to her room in a fit of despair, remorse, and outrage. As preparations began for the child's death, Annie once again reached out to the other side. "Dr. Anderson, what happened?
How did this go so wrong? How could you do this to a child? You're not a doctor at all. You're a killer. Damn you, Dr. Anderson. Damn your soul. Damn your soul to hell.
Suddenly, the floor began to shake. The lights began to dim and buzz and pop with unbridled intensity. The fog fell over Annie once more, but this time she was still conscious, as her body was taken over by an unknown spirit. Like a cursed marionette puppet, Annie's arms and legs began to float on their own accord, like a weightless underwater dance. Suddenly, as though by magic, a pen materialized in one hand and the parchment in the other. Hysterically, Annie began to mar the parchment with crazed slashes of the pen, ripping the paper to tatters, and then taking to the desk to continue her rampage. Ferociously, she slashed, tore, and shredded everything in sight. Abruptly, Annie's rage came to an ominous, menacing halt as she picked up a sliver of parchment and began to write, "You fool. I am not Dr. Anderson." As though the paranormal strings that had been controlling her suddenly had snapped, Annie fell to the floor with an almighty crash. The Houstons ran into the room, worried and confused. There they found Annie Whipple, in a crumpled heap on the floor. In a faint and fragile voice, Annie confessed her dalliances with the occult. Shortly after, she too joined Dr. Anderson in the land of the dead. As though trading one life for another, as the sun rose the following day, so did the sickly child. Miraculously, she was healed. Ultimately, Annie Whipple's descent into the occult did work. Do you ever lie awake in bed at night and wonder, what is happening in the West London Witch Patreon? Are you plagued by the feeling that you're missing out? Do you want more content and a sneaky look into the inner workings of the West London Witch? Well, I just wanted to pop in and say that joining Patreon is super easy and affordable. I am very aware that we are deep in a cost of living crisis. So for as little as $1, €1, £1 a month, you can unlock the entire West London Witch Patreon and gain access to loads of additional content that you will never experience here on the main show. Patreon is a place where I share extra special interviews, behind-the-scenes stories and gossip, and answer your questions. And in return, you're also helping support the show as we work to share with you the best storytelling at the highest studio quality. So come join us at patreon.com/The West London Witch. Hello and welcome to episode 81 of The West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. Last season, we were lucky enough to have the entire cast of Haunted Discoveries featured on the podcast. Lead investigator Mustafa Gatollari had such a fun time last year He very generously offered to come back on the show and share another fascinating story with us. When you last heard from Mustafa in episode 60, Plagued by the Paranormal, he shared a deeply personal paranormal experience with us. A raw and confronting clash between culture, religion, and our personal perceptions and interpretations of the paranormal. Today, Mustafa is back with a story that was featured on Haunted Discoveries. Once again, he's really asking us to push our understanding of the supernatural and the effect that we may have on the supposed other side. I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is The West London Witch, Episode 81, The Legend of Annie Whipple.
So the story that I wanted to talk about was from our first season of Haunted Discoveries. It was the second location that we were filming in, which was the Louisville Bourbon Inn. And when we initially set out to produce this show, there were a few sections of our thesis that we wanted to hit. And one of the biggest ones, was separating fact from fiction when it came to a location's history. One of the most annoying things about being in the paranormal TV space is watching a lot of other shows kind of go off all the time on these urban legends that we knew weren't true with a location. Things that are very easily debunked by a quick Google search online. And yet, because they make for good sound bites on TV, and because a place needs to be haunted, and the gnarlier the haunting, the better for a lot of production companies, they just kind of would turn a blind eye to whatever convenient narrative fit their beat sheets. And Brandon and I always saw this as very lazy and disingenuous and insulting, really, to viewers.
The goal and ethos surrounding Haunted Discoveries is to always share honest, authentic, and historically accurate content that is supported by fact, not myth and legend. The team take great care and pride in their ability to expose their viewers to genuine paranormal investigations. They're not out to sensationalize or manufacture hauntings for the sake of views or shock value.
With the Louisville Bourbon Inn, there was one story that stood out above all the others associated with the location, and that is the story of a woman named Annie Whipple. Local historian, writer, and Renaissance man, really, David Domine, he told it in a very, very beautiful way, but we had known the story before we had arrived on location. And our research pretty much proved that Annie Whipple didn't exist, which was extremely strange because there were claims from people all over the country and the world who stayed at the Louisville Bourbon Inn and claimed to see the same thing.
There are endless reports from guests and staff of the Louisville Bourbon Inn recounting seeing a woman clad all in black, both ascending and descending a particular staircase in the inn. It is presumed that that apparition is the ghost of Annie Whipple.
Over decades, different time periods, different people who did not know each other all saw this same phenomena. So, we, wanting to kind of really fully immerse ourselves in the Annie Whipple experience, decided to live out the Annie Whipple story, because it seemed like what was going on was that, and this is a theory we had, is that there were people who were repeating the story of Annie Whipple over and over again, that it was somehow creating a thought form manifestation, maybe.
The concept of a thought form manifestation is not a new idea here on the West London Witch. We have dug deep in the past into studies, such as the Philip experiment, and several storytellers have alluded to the phenomenon in the past. The basic premise of a thought form manifestation was described by Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater in their study, Thought Form Manifestations, a record of clairvoyant investigation in 1905. Their findings hypothesized that inner thoughts, feelings, or ideas could manifest in the corporal world. Basically, if you believe something hard enough, it can come true. If enough people believe, share, and retell the same ghost story over and over again, they could manifest the story into being, regardless of its veracity.
Honestly, I initially wanted to just live out the Annie Whipple story and do all of the beats of it, which I'll get into in a bit, just because it's cool. I mean, there's Santeria, there's a seance for TV. It's great. You got candles. It's kind of like spooky and romantic in a way. But what we did discover through a lot of our past investigations is that when you're acting stuff out, a lot of times that kind of triggers some type of weird spiritual collective consciousness, and you're tapping into something.
This entire investigation and the story of Annie Whipple, which I outlined at the top of the episode, all take place inside the stunning Louisville Bourbon Inn in Louisville, Kentucky. Built in the 1880s, this gorgeous Victorian mansion is now a bed and breakfast, wedding venue, and hosts both bourbon and ghost tours. The mansion was built for an attorney by the name of Russell Houston, who commissioned the 8,800 square foot Richardsonian Romanesque revival home in 1880. After 7 years of construction, the building was complete, and the Houstons moved in. Both Russell and his wife died in the home, but the story regarding Annie Whipple really falls apart when you realize that all of the Houstons' children were adult by the time of the completion of the home. In addition to the lack of children in the home, there is zero evidence that Annie herself had anything to do with the Houstons or Louisville. However, the legend is prolific and compelling. A lot of people connect with this tale. As dramatic and as fantastical as the story may be, the root of it is very relatable. Mustafa himself empathizes with Annie's desperation and anguish.
When you're in that headspace, especially if you kind of come from a religious background or something, which I'd imagine she was, you tend to turn to fantastical solutions. Growing up, I grew up really religious, and my mother had hypothyroidism, and I'd seen her body completely change over a couple of years, and her demeanor changed. And I used to constantly, I was so religious, I'd pray 5 times a day, and in the course of praying 5 times a day, I think as long as you're praying the minimum prayers, your head would hit the ground 17 times. No, 34 times a day, because you're doing it twice. So your head would hit the ground 34 times. 34 times a day, every single time my head hit the ground, I would make a quick prayer and ask God to heal my mother's hypothyroidism. Every time, every Ramadan, I'd sleep at the mosque every single night of Ramadan, and I'd put my head to the ground and I'd sit there and I'd pray to God to cure my mother's hypothyroidism. I looked up ancient, healing practices. Black seed oil was supposed to be this great thing. So I scoured every kind of solution that could help her. And now she's got it under control. I don't think it's because of God. I think it's because of a certain medication she's taking, and then she consulted with a doctor. So big ups to that. And they finally managed to find what worked with her. But Annie Whipple didn't have that luxury at the time. So we had this story of Annie Whipple. We don't have any record of her existing. We don't have a record of a hoodoo woman that entirely fits the description of the story. But we do have a record of someone named Annie Whipple who lived in Kentucky, just not in Louisville. And we do have a very weird story about a woman who was believed to have been a spiritual practitioner who lived next door to the Louisville Bourbon Inn. And at that house, a woman's amputated arm was found nailed to the front of the home. So there's a lot of gnarly things that happened. To top it all off, there is another weird story associated with Louisville around that same time period involving witches. This is the West London Witch Show, so I think it's appropriate. But there's a witch's tree in Louisville, and it's a gnarled tree. It looks like it was struck by lightning. I think it was. And there were witches in the area who would conduct spells for people, and people would make offerings to this witch's tree. And there was a specific tree that people would make offerings to, and a lumber company had come and cut it down. And these witches warned them not to do it. And then they said, and this is true, you can look this up, this happened. Right before, right after they cut it down, the witches said, you are going to pay for this. And they basically swore that they would get revenge. And I think it was within just a few days of that happening, maybe even sooner, the worst tornado up until like 2 years ago that ever hit the area completely ravaged Louisville.
The loss of the witch's tree was devastational. But fear not, because locals established a new witch's tree, a fantastically twisted and dramatically gnarled tree covered in gifts and offerings left by fellow witches and tourists.
So what we decided to do was, okay, let's live out the story of Annie Whipple. We are going to conduct a seance with an Espiritismo practitioner. We found one by the name of Angelique Stacy, who says that she saw Annie Whipple there. And we had her conduct the whole seance with gopher dust, the grave dust. We did the whole ritual. We cleansed ourselves. And on top of that, I went to the witch's tree and I specifically made an offering of my soul to capture the apparition of Annie Whipple on camera. And I was kind of doing it as a joke, but at the same time, I was really serious because, I don't care. My soul's up for barter. If we're going to capture evidence of the paranormal, that's fine. I got a name to make for myself here. And if it costs me my soul, then so be it. I made other offerings jokingly too. I had a vape and some chocolate, and I ended up giving away the chocolate because, you're gonna pry the vape out of my cold dead hands. So I made that offering during the day, the chocolate and my soul for, footage of Annie Whipple.
Like a modern-day Dr. Faustus, Mustafa offered to exchange his literal soul for measurable proof of Annie's existence. But the question is, was Mustafa's soul worth enough for the payoff?
Later that night, while we're conducting the seance, we hear something, a voice. I don't know what it was in the moment. I don't think any of us knew what it was in the moment. Earlier that day, we thought we heard noises, footsteps upstairs. And it was a really, really great investigation. The tone of it was fantastic. Everybody was really, really emotionally buying into the seance, and the tension that we created with that atmosphere was just beautiful. I mean, there's no way to replicate it. And it was the tension of oh my gosh, it's our second, episode that we're filming of our own series. And this is really cool. We're so heavily invested in this Annie Whipple story, and we just had David Domine tell us the tale completely unbroken in just like one amazing, beautiful kind of take. And we're just sitting there like, holy crap, Annie Whipple's here, even though she didn't exist. What the hell? So we had some control cameras, specifically the EMCCD camera, the electron multiplying camera, which is what NASA uses to study photonic events in outer space, monitor and study black holes. And we've captured a lot of really cool stuff on the EMCCD, because any kind of paranormal investigator or people who experience something they may be believed to be paranormal will tell you there's almost always like a light. And we've correlated those light anomalies with changes in the environment, barometric pressure, stuff like that. So we conducted some experiments. We had a Tesla coil, and we, put electromagnetic frequencies out into the atmosphere of this room, and we got a voice, and that was really cool with the seance. And when we went back to listen to the audio, it was definitely a voice of nobody in our crew or anybody, any of our investigators or production members, and it was coming from above us, and it sounded like a woman's voice.
Have a listen to this EVP that was caught during the seance of a voice saying, Annie.
And then weirdly enough, when we're reviewing the footage of the seance, Angelique, there's something hovering above her head. And I don't know what the heck it is. It was so strange. And we only captured that when Brandon was cutting the episode together. But that's not the weirdest thing that happened that night. The weirdest thing that happened that night, we didn't even recognize it in the moment. It was only until a few days later when Brandon was reviewing our video footage. And I've been fortunate enough being on the road with Brandon in multiple seasons of Haunted Discoveries and also Ghost Hunters. My favorite thing that happens is when I get a call from him at like 3 or 4 in the morning when he's like reviewing footage or something, calls me up. Dude, come to my room right now. It's my favorite thing that I ever received. It's literally my favorite phone call.
Frantically, Mustafa bolted from his hotel room and ran down the hall to Brandon. Brandon was a buzz of excitement and energy. On his laptop was a piece of video evidence queued up and ready to show Mustafa.
And sure enough, it's the stairwell in the Louisville Bourbon Inn. And he goes, watch this. Tell me I'm not crazy. What do you see? He hits play. A few seconds go by. And on the EMCCD camera is a full shadow apparition of a woman in a black Victorian era dress walking up those stairs. After that, you see me walk up the stairs, looks completely different. You see other people walking up the stairs, completely different. We show that to Angelique. She's like, that's what I saw. Show it to David Domine. That's what everybody at the Louisville Bourbon Inn sees.
This piece of footage is absolutely amazing. It starts with a still framed shot focused on the stairs. After a few moments, a black misty shadow figure that resembles a woman in a full dress glides up the stairs in a measured and purposeful fashion. It is a fantastic piece of evidence, and I can see why it delighted and shocked the team.
How in the world is there a ghost of someone in a building when they never existed? And that investigation and the results of that investigation really kind of completely called into question what our understandings of hauntings and paranormal activity are. It completely opened the door to ideas of thought form manifestation. You know, a lot of paranormal investigators will say, like, oh, when we're like going out and I get a lot of things with these people, but with this group, I don't. Are we bringing energies to investigations? Can we actively try to trigger something? Is the act of actually physically doing something affecting the environment? And I think about that a lot. I think about that with relationships. I think about that with work. I think about that with our own emotional kind of well-being. I think it's something that has a universal kind of human connection. The idea that actionable tasks and a demonstrated desire to believe in something has more power than what the truth or honesty of a situation could ever have. And I think that that's something we've considered in every investigation moving forward from that point on. To me, a lot of the work of Haunted Discoveries and APRA has been heavily inspired by the find we had at the Louisville Bourbon Inn.
Mustafa is convinced if it was not for the team's total dedication to the seance, the witch's tree offering, and the desire to capture the evidence of Annie, that there is no way that this investigation would have been as fruitful or successful. Who knows? Perhaps Mustafa's soul was taken in exchange for this incredible experience at the Louisville Bourbon Inn. Make sure you head on over to the West London Witch Instagram and Facebook to check out the footage of Annie's ghost climbing the stairs. And while you're there, why not show Haunted Discoveries some love with a like and a follow? You can watch the entire Haunted Discovery episode, The Tragic Legend of Desperate Witch Annie Whipple at Bourbon Inn, episode 102, for free on Haunt TV on YouTube. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.